Welcome to Luxurious Tales. If you love powerful stories, don't forget to like, share, and comment. Subscribe to Luxurious Tales and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. Listen closely. The story begins now. Naomi Hartwell learned very early in life that chaos was not loud, it was quiet, creeping, and often arrived disguised as love that failed to stay. She was 9 when her mother, Daphne Hartwell, vanished from their small rented home without ceremony or explanation, leaving behind a half-empty closet and questions that would never be answered at bedtime. From that moment, Naomi's world narrowed to the steady, uncompromising presence of her father, a man who believed discipline was a form of protection. He woke her before dawn, taught her how to fold clothes with precision, how to keep a schedule, how to prepare meals even when tired, and how to never let emotions spill publicly. There were no dramatic speeches about resilience, only action. Naomi internalized his lessons deeply, growing into a woman who craved order, who believed peace was something built deliberately, brick by brick. She promised herself she would never live reactively, never beg for stability, never allow her life to feel like a room constantly on fire. Calm, to Naomi, was not a luxury, it was survival. Her first adult job tested that promise in ways she never anticipated. Fresh out of college and eager to prove herself, Naomi accepted a junior coordination role at a mid-range hospitality firm known for impossible deadlines and volatile clients. On her third week, a major corporate luncheon collapsed into near disaster when a supplier failed to deliver key equipment, staff members panicked, and supervisors began shouting blame instead of solutions. Naomi was not the most senior person in the room, nor the loudest, but she was the only one who stopped moving frantically. She assessed what could be salvaged, reassigned staff without raising her voice, contacted backup vendors from her personal phone, and reorganized the space to minimize visible damage. Her hands shook slightly as she worked, but her voice did not. When the event ended, imperfect but functional, her manager barely acknowledged her effort. Still, something solidified inside Naomi that day. She realized professionalism was not about praise, it was about showing up steadily when everything else unraveled. That understanding would quietly shape every major decision she made. It was during that same turbulent period that Naomi met Raina Brooks, a nurse manager whose presence cut through noise the way clarity cuts through fog. They met accidentally in a hospital cafeteria, both exhausted, both silently observing a public argument between two strangers that no one else seemed willing to interrupt. Naomi intervened calmly, de-escalating the situation with firm boundaries and measured language. Raina noticed, not just the action, but the restraint behind it. They started talking, first about small things, then about the invisible weight women carried when they were expected to hold everything together without complaint. Raina admired Naomi's composure. Naomi admired Raina's directness. Their friendship formed not from convenience, but from mutual recognition, two women who understood that strength was not performative. Naomi left that cafeteria with more than a new friend. She left with a subtle sense that life was aligning, that maybe the discipline she had inherited would finally lead her somewhere safe. She did not yet know how violently that belief would be tested. Colton Reeve grew up learning that silence was failure and visibility was currency. In the Reeve household, nothing mattered unless it could be displayed, measured, or envied. His mother, Vera Reeve, curated appearances the way others curated memories, teaching Colton that admiration was not optional, it was survival. Praise was rationed, affection conditional, and disappointment delivered with surgical precision. His father, Julian Reeve, observed from the edges, a quiet presence who offered stability but rarely interference. Julian believed lessons were best learned through consequence, not instruction, and his distance taught Colton an unintended truth: approval must be earned loudly or not at all. As a boy, Colton learned to speak confidently even when unsure, to smile through pressure, to perform competence before he fully possessed it. By the time he entered adulthood, he did not simply want to succeed, he needed to be seen succeeding. Applause became oxygen, and without it, he felt dangerously close to disappearing. That hunger followed him into his early career, where competition was ruthless and image often outweighed substance. Colton was intelligent and capable, but what set him apart was his willingness to bend truth when the reward justified it. The first time he crossed that line was subtle enough to feel harmless, an embellished resume detail during a crucial pitch review, a strategic omission that made his role in a project appear more central than it had been. When the decision went his way and the applause followed, something shifted. The discomfort he expected never arrived. Instead, relief washed over him, accompanied by validation he craved. From that moment, Colton learned that perception could be engineered, and he became increasingly skilled at shaping narratives in his favor. He told himself he was simply playing the game better than others, that ambition required flexibility. Yet beneath that justification was a quieter truth he refused to confront. He feared being ordinary more than he feared being dishonest. It was during a networking retreat, one designed to reward confidence over caution, that Colton met Harper Sloan. Harper was everything Colton admired and envied, charming without effort, decisive without apology, and visibly successful. They connected over shared ambitions and mutual recognition, each sensing in the other a useful ally rather than a friend. Over late-night drinks and strategic conversations, they spoke openly about influence, leverage, and the value of being indispensable. Harper proposed a partnership not rooted in loyalty, but in image, a collaboration where they would amplify each other's reputations while quietly consolidating control. Colton agreed without hesitation, thrilled by the validation and the promise of rapid ascent. He did not notice how quickly he began adjusting his behavior to match Harper's moral flexibility, nor how easily ambition muted his better judgment. What Colton saw was momentum, applause growing louder, and a future that finally felt worthy of his mother's approval. He did not yet see the cost. The winter banquet was supposed to be flawless, an annual high-profile affair attended by executives, donors, and social elites who expected precision disguised as ease. Naomi had been assigned as part of the on-site coordination team, a role that demanded invisibility when things went right and accountability when they didn't. Halfway through setup, the illusion shattered. A delivery truck broke down miles away with critical equipment still inside it, a key vendor sent the wrong inventory, and a sudden change in guest count threw the seating plan into chaos. Voices rose, supervisors barked orders that contradicted each other, and panic spread faster than solutions. Naomi felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the warning sign of chaos she despised, but she didn't freeze. She stepped forward, reorganized priorities, reassigned tasks calmly, and began making rapid calls to secure backups. Her movements were efficient, her tone steady. Guests would never know how close the evening came to collapse, but Naomi would. Colton Reeve arrived amid the confusion, unaware of the crisis unfolding behind the scenes. To him, the banquet was another arena, an opportunity to be seen, to network, to reinforce his rising reputation. Dressed impeccably and radiating confidence, he moved through the room greeting contacts and absorbing admiration. It wasn't until he caught sight of Naomi that his attention shifted. She wasn't performing for anyone, wasn't dressed to impress, wasn't angling for recognition. She was simply managing disaster with quiet authority, commanding respect without demanding it. Colton watched her from a distance, intrigued by the contrast between her composure and the frantic energy around her. When the evening concluded successfully and applause filled the room, Colton knew the applause wasn't truly for him, but he felt drawn to the woman who had made it possible without stepping into the spotlight. For the first time in a long while, admiration stirred without calculation. He approached Naomi later with practiced charm, introducing himself as if the entire room hadn't already known his name. He complimented the event, praised the coordination, and casually suggested they continue the conversation over dinner sometime. Naomi listened politely, thanked him, and declined without hesitation. Her refusal wasn't sharp or dismissive, it was measured, thoughtful, and grounded in boundaries she had learned to protect fiercely. She told him she valued clarity and intention, and that she didn't mix work environments with personal advances easily. Colton smiled, unaccustomed to resistance that didn't challenge him outright. Naomi walked away feeling a flicker of curiosity she refused to indulge too quickly. Colton watched her leave, unsettled in a way he couldn't immediately name. For once, applause hadn't opened the door, and that made Naomi Hartwell unforgettable. Their early dates unfolded without fireworks, and that was precisely what unsettled Colton. Naomi insisted on simplicity, quiet dinners, long walks, conversations that lingered on values rather than status. She listened more than she spoke, asked questions that weren't decorative, and paused when answers felt rehearsed. Colton, accustomed to winning people quickly, found himself recalibrating. His charm met her boundaries and slowed, reshaped, softened. Naomi did not hide her standards. She spoke plainly about wanting emotional safety, honesty, and a life that felt calm rather than impressive. Colton found himself trying harder, not to impress, but to be understood. The absence of instant chemistry gave way to something steadier, more deliberate. Naomi remained cautious, intrigued by Colton's intelligence and presence, but alert to the subtle ways he framed himself as exceptional. She liked him, but she watched him carefully, believing attraction should be tested by time. Owen Hartwell watched from farther back, where patterns were easier to see. Protective by nature and sharpened by his years of military service, Owen didn't interrogate Naomi, he investigated Colton. Quiet background checks, conversations with mutual contacts, observations made without accusation. He noted Colton's curated narratives, his comfort with influence, his tendency to steer rooms. None of it was criminal, all of it was concerning. Owen met Colton once under the guise of courtesy, measuring him not by words but by restraint. The tension was subtle but unmistakable. Owen warned Naomi gently, never demanding she end things, only reminding her that ambition often arrived wearing a friendly face. Naomi appreciated the respect in his caution. She didn't dismiss Owen's instincts, but she didn't surrender her agency either. She believed people could be more than their worst tendencies, if they chose to be. That belief was tested when Naomi's father suffered a sudden health scare late one night, collapsing at home and requiring emergency care. Naomi was overwhelmed, torn between fear and logistics, unsure of who to call. Colton arrived at the hospital without being asked, having sensed the gravity in Naomi's voice earlier. He didn't bring grand gestures or promises. He sat quietly, handled paperwork, fetched coffee, and stayed through the long, uncertain hours. When Naomi finally broke, exhausted and frightened, Colton didn't interrupt or fix. He simply stayed. It was the first time Naomi saw him without performance, without polish, just present. That night shifted something fundamental. She allowed herself to believe that Colton's hunger for admiration might coexist with genuine care. And Colton, in turn, felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, a desire to be worthy, not applauded. Meeting Colton's family was not an accident, it was a test disguised as hospitality. Naomi sensed it the moment she stepped into the Reeve residence, a place curated to impress rather than comfort. Every surface gleamed, every detail intentional, as though warmth itself had been edited out. Vera Reeve greeted Naomi with a smile that never reached her eyes, her tone polite but sharpened by judgment. She asked questions that sounded benign but carried subtext, about Naomi's upbringing, her career pace, her long-term ambitions. Each inquiry designed to measure worth against an invisible standard Naomi had never agreed to. Naomi answered honestly, refusing to embellish or shrink herself, even as she felt the subtle pressure to perform. She noticed how Vera corrected Colton casually, how she dominated conversation without raising her voice, how approval was granted sparingly and withdrawn quickly. Naomi left that evening composed on the outside, unsettled within, aware she had been evaluated and found lacking by criteria she neither respected nor shared. Julian Reeve offered a different presence altogether. Quiet, observant, and almost peripheral, he watched interactions more than he shaped them. Late in the evening, he found Naomi alone near the back garden, the noise of conversation muted by distance. His words were few but weighted. Without accusation or explanation, he said simply, "Watch what people hide, not what they show." The comment lingered long after he walked away, echoing in Naomi's mind with uncomfortable clarity. She wondered what Julian had seen over the years that made him speak so carefully, so indirectly. The contrast between him and Vera was stark, one ruled by control, the other by restraint. Naomi felt the first true flicker of unease, not about Colton himself, but about the environment he had been shaped by and the expectations that would inevitably follow her if she stayed. The argument came later, after they left, unfolding quietly in the car rather than explosively at the table. Naomi told Colton how the evening made her feel, measured, dismissed, subtly diminished. Colton listened, defensive at first, insisting his mother was simply particular, that she meant well. But as Naomi spoke with calm precision, something shifted. She wasn't accusing, she was explaining her boundaries. Colton promised her then, earnestly, that she would never be made to feel small for who she was, not by his family, not by him. He spoke of partnership, of protecting what mattered, of building a future separate from expectations imposed by others. Naomi wanted to believe him. She chose to believe him. She didn't yet realize that promises made under pressure often revealed intention, but promises kept revealed character. Colton planned the proposal the way he planned everything else in his life, with scale, visibility, and maximum impact. It unfolded at a private rooftop gathering overlooking the city skyline, timed precisely at sunset, attended by carefully selected friends and associates who would later recount the moment with admiration. There were lights, music, and a speech that spoke of destiny and certainty. When Colton dropped to one knee, applause followed before Naomi could even process what was happening. She felt the weight of the moment press against her chest, not just the proposal itself, but the expectations wrapped around it. She loved Colton, yes, but she couldn't ignore how the moment felt curated for witnesses rather than intimacy. Still, when she looked at his face, she saw something sincere layered beneath the performance. She said yes, quietly, choosing hope over hesitation, believing that love did not have to be perfect to be real. Raina Brooks was less convinced. She hugged Naomi tightly afterward, her smile warm but her eyes searching. Later, away from the celebration, Raina voiced what she'd been holding back, that Colton seemed to love the idea of milestones as much as the person beside him. She didn't tell Naomi to walk away, she simply asked whether Naomi felt chosen or displayed. Around the same time, Owen confronted Colton directly, not with threats but with clarity. He reminded Colton that Naomi did not need saving or showcasing, she needed respect. Colton responded with confidence, even charm, assuring Owen that he understood responsibility, that Naomi was not a phase or a symbol. Owen didn't argue. He simply said, "Then act like it," and walked away, unconvinced but watchful. Naomi stood between those perspectives, torn but resolute. She spent long nights journaling, unpacking her fears and hopes with painful honesty. She questioned whether love could grow into what it wasn't yet, whether commitment could temper ego. In the end, she chose belief, not blindly, but deliberately. She believed that Colton's ambition did not have to eclipse his capacity for partnership, that shared life could soften sharp edges. Naomi wasn't naive, she was hopeful, and she understood the risk she was taking. When she accepted the ring, she wasn't surrendering her standards, she was betting on growth. What she didn't yet understand was that growth requires humility, and humility was something Colton had never truly been forced to learn. The wedding day arrived wrapped in elegance and precision, every detail orchestrated to project harmony and success. Naomi looked radiant, not because of the dress or the setting, but because she believed she was stepping into a partnership grounded in intention. As she walked down the aisle, she noticed Vera Reeves' composed expression, pleasant, approving, and distant, like a spectator evaluating a completed acquisition. Julian's gaze lingered longer, thoughtful and unreadable. The vows were sincere on the surface, spoken clearly and confidently, and Naomi meant every word. She promised steadiness, honesty, and loyalty. Colton promised devotion and protection, his voice steady, his smile assured. Applause followed again, louder than the silence Naomi had hoped for in that moment. Still, as they shared their first quiet breath together as husband and wife, Naomi believed marriage could be a space where performance gave way to authenticity, where mirrors were replaced by windows. The adjustment came quickly. Colton's world moved fast, measured by appearances and expectations Naomi had never agreed to but was now expected to navigate. There were unspoken rules about how she should dress at certain events, what she should say, and when she should stay silent. Naomi learned that in Colton's circles, perception mattered as much as reality. She found herself introduced not as Naomi, but as Colton's wife, her identity subtly reframed. She didn't resist openly, instead, she observed, cataloging moments when compromise felt reasonable and moments when it felt eroding. Colton didn't notice the shift at first, he was proud of her, proud to have her by his side, but he also assumed she would adapt seamlessly. Naomi began to understand that love alone would not protect her from being reshaped by expectations she had not chosen. Temptation entered quietly, wearing opportunity's face. Harper Sloan began visiting more frequently, drawing Colton into conversations that extended late into the night. He spoke of expansion, of strategic alliances, of shortcuts disguised as efficiency. The business world, Harper insisted, rewarded boldness, not hesitation. Colton listened, intrigued, energized by the promise of accelerated success. Naomi overheard fragments of these discussions, phrases that hinted at moral flexibility and risk, but she chose not to intrude. She wanted to trust her husband, to believe partnership meant transparency without surveillance. Still, a subtle unease settled in her chest, the kind that didn't announce itself loudly but refused to leave. Marriage, she was learning, reflected not just love, but the truths people were willing, or unwilling, to share. Sienna Vale entered Colton's world the way she entered every room, with intention sharpened into instinct. She appeared at an elite social event hosted by one of Harper Sloane's associates, an evening designed to blur business and indulgence until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. Sienna was dressed impeccably, not flamboyantly, her confidence measured rather than loud. She watched before she moved, listened before she spoke, studying the dynamics of power with practiced ease. When she noticed Colton, she didn't rush him. She observed how people leaned in when he spoke, how his laughter carried, how he subtly performed leadership even in casual conversation. Sienna recognized hunger when she saw it, the need to be admired, affirmed, elevated. She introduced herself with just enough warmth to linger in his thoughts, offering admiration that felt specific rather than generic. Colton felt seen in a way that flattered his ego deeply, and Sienna noted that reaction with quiet satisfaction. From that first interaction, Sienna began positioning herself strategically. She didn't challenge Naomi directly or make herself obvious. Instead, she placed herself within Colton's orbit, appearing at the same events, echoing his opinions, praising his insight in ways that felt effortless. She spoke often about ambition, about how difficult it was to rise without support, about the loneliness of striving in competitive spaces. Colton found these conversations energizing, a contrast to the grounded, introspective discussions he shared with Naomi. With Sienna, admiration came freely, without expectation of self-examination. She never asked him to slow down or reflect, she encouraged momentum. Harper noticed the shift and said nothing, understanding instinctively how useful Sienna could become. To Sienna, Colton was not a man, he was access, momentum, and possibility combined. Naomi felt the change before she could articulate it. It wasn't infidelity, not yet, but something more subtle and unsettling. Colton became more distracted, more absorbed in external validation, more eager to recount how others admired him. Sienna's name surfaced casually, then more frequently, always framed as harmless, professional, inconsequential. Naomi observed the small moments, Colton checking his phone more often, smiling at messages he didn't explain, growing impatient with conversations that required vulnerability. She didn't accuse him, instead, she paid attention. Each tiny dismissal, each delayed response, each instance where she felt slightly sidelined began stacking quietly, like cracks forming beneath polished glass. Naomi didn't yet know who Sienna Vale truly was, but she understood instinctively that her presence marked the beginning of something shifting, something that would demand clarity, courage, and eventually, consequence. Colton's absences began innocently enough, disguised as necessity rather than choice. Meetings ran late, dinners were postponed, weekends became fragmented by obligations that sounded important but felt increasingly vague. Naomi noticed how his schedule grew fuller while his presence thinned, how conversations shortened and silences lengthened. He remained affectionate in public, attentive when observed, but at home his mind seemed elsewhere, tethered to a world she was no longer fully invited into. Naomi did not jump to conclusions, she had built her life on intention, not impulse. Instead, she adjusted, giving him space while quietly assessing patterns. She believed relationships required seasons of imbalance, moments when one partner carried more weight. Yet even patience had limits, and the sense of being deferred, of coming second to something unnamed, began to unsettle her carefully built calm. Her father noticed before she spoke. During a routine visit, he watched Naomi move through her kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing food while her thoughts drifted elsewhere. When she finally sat across from him, he spoke gently but firmly, reminding her of a truth he had lived by: love without honesty becomes a trap. He didn't accuse Colton or plant suspicion, he simply urged Naomi not to ignore her instincts in the name of peace. His words struck deeply because they echoed her own unspoken fears. Naomi had learned long ago that silence could be as damaging as conflict, that avoidance often masqueraded as strength. She left her father's home carrying both reassurance and resolve, understanding that calm should never require self-erasure. If something was wrong, she would face it with clarity, not fear. Evidence arrived quietly, almost apologetically. A receipt that didn't align with Colton's explanation. A message notification that vanished too quickly. A social photo Naomi wasn't meant to see, tagged vaguely but suggestively. None of it was definitive, and Naomi refused to become someone who monitored or chased shadows. She chose communication instead. That evening, she asked Colton direct questions, not accusatory but clear. He responded smoothly, offering explanations that sounded reasonable, even caring. Naomi listened, searching not just his words but the space between them. She didn't confront him further, she didn't demand proof. She decided something far more difficult, to observe patiently, to prepare herself emotionally for whatever truth might emerge. The glass had cracked, and Naomi understood that once fractures appeared, pretending they weren't there only guaranteed shattering later. The opportunity arrived wrapped in urgency and framed as inevitability. Harper Sloan called Colton late one evening, his tone sharpened by excitement and risk, outlining a contract that could elevate their position overnight. It involved a complex partnership, layered approvals, and a timetable that rewarded speed over scrutiny. Harper spoke of competitors circling, of decision-makers who respected boldness, of how hesitation could cost them everything they had built. Colton listened, adrenaline rising, his mind already projecting the applause that would follow success. The details were technical and dense, but one thing was clear: the path Harper proposed cut corners that would never survive daylight. Colton hesitated briefly, not because he didn't understand the risk, but because he understood the reward too well. He told himself this was strategy, not deception, efficiency in a system that punished patience. By the time the call ended, he had agreed to proceed, unaware that the choice marked a point of no return. To manage the exposure, Harper introduced Colton to Felix Rowe, a man whose reputation was whispered rather than advertised. Felix was called doctor not for credentials, but for his ability to treat crises before they became fatal. He spoke calmly, asked precise questions, and offered solutions that focused on containment rather than correction. Felix's role was simple: shape narratives, bury inconsistencies, and ensure that if scrutiny came, it would arrive confused and late. Colton found comfort in Felix's confidence, mistaking control for safety. Meetings were arranged discreetly, documents reviewed selectively, and language adjusted to soften hard edges. Each step felt small enough to justify, each compromise incremental. Colton didn't notice how easily he deferred judgment to people who benefited from his silence, or how quickly integrity became a negotiable asset. Momentum drowned out caution, and applause, imagined but intoxicating, pulled him forward. Unseen by Colton, another set of eyes had begun to track the ripples of Harper's deal. Detective Mara Linwood specialized in financial crimes that thrived on complexity and speed, cases where wrongdoing hid behind jargon and urgency. She noticed irregularities in transaction timing, inconsistencies that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Mara didn't rush, she mapped patterns, building a quiet framework of understanding. Names surfaced repeatedly: Harper Sloan, intermediaries, shell agreements, forming a constellation that hinted at something larger. Colton Reeves' name appeared on the periphery, not yet central but increasingly relevant. Mara noted it without judgment, aware that ambition often made people accessories before it made them architects. As Colton celebrated progress and Naomi sensed distance growing at home, an investigation began assembling itself piece by piece, patient and precise, waiting for the moment when truth would no longer be containable. Naomi planned their anniversary the way she planned everything, with care, intention, and restraint. She chose a quiet restaurant tucked away from spectacle, reserved a corner table where conversation could unfold without interruption, and prepared a handwritten note she intended to give Colton privately. The day itself felt weighted with hope. Anniversaries, Naomi believed, were checkpoints where couples recalibrated and recommitted. She dressed simply, not to impress, but to feel grounded. When Colton texted late afternoon to say a meeting had run longer than expected, Naomi didn't react immediately. She asked when he would arrive, offered flexibility, and waited. As the hours stretched on, her anticipation thinned into disappointment she refused to dramatize. When the final message came, an apology paired with a vague promise to make it up later, Naomi closed the note without tearing it. She paid the reservation cancellation fee quietly and walked home alone, aware that something meaningful had been deferred without urgency. The confirmation arrived not through confrontation, but through chance. Naomi scrolled absent-mindedly on her phone, not searching for anything in particular, when she saw a photo posted by someone she barely knew, an event snapshot tagged loosely, framed as spontaneous. In the background, unmistakable and close, stood Colton. He wasn't alone. Sienna Vale was beside him, her posture familiar, her smile unguarded, her hand resting with an ease that suggested rehearsal rather than coincidence. The timestamp aligned too perfectly with the meeting that had displaced their anniversary. Naomi didn't gasp or cry, she felt something colder and clearer settle in her chest. The image didn't scream betrayal, but it whispered it with devastating precision. Naomi understood then that truth rarely announced itself dramatically. More often, it revealed itself casually, confident that the observer would finally be ready to see it. That night, Naomi didn't confront Colton. She didn't demand explanations or seek reassurance that would only blur clarity. Instead, she made a decision that felt both terrifying and stabilizing. She would confirm the truth on her own terms. She began paying closer attention, not obsessively, but deliberately. She noted schedules, patterns, inconsistencies. She gathered facts quietly, refusing to let emotion cloud judgment. Naomi wasn't preparing for revenge, she was preparing for reality. She understood that certainty required patience, and patience required strength. As she lay awake, the weight of the coming revelation pressed against her resolve, but she did not retreat. Whatever awaited her, Naomi would meet it with dignity, not desperation. The theater had ended. What came next would be real, irreversible, and defining. Naomi did not rush the moment of discovery, it came to her because she allowed truth the space to reveal itself. She followed patterns, not impulses, choosing a night when Colton's explanations were thin and his confidence overly rehearsed. The location was unremarkable, which made the reality more brutal, a private lounge she had passed dozens of times without consequence. From a distance that protected her dignity, Naomi saw them together with unmistakable clarity. There was no ambiguity to hide behind, no context that softened what she witnessed. Colton's posture was relaxed in a way it had not been with her in months, his laughter unguarded, his attention undivided. Sienna Vale leaned into him with practiced ease, not tentative, not uncertain, but assured. Naomi felt pain, yes, sharp and immediate, but beneath it was something steadier, recognition. The waiting was over. The truth had finally arrived, clean and undeniable. She returned home before Colton, not to confront him, but to reclaim herself. Naomi moved through the house with deliberate calm, opening drawers, selecting essentials, folding clothes with the same precision her father had taught her years ago. Each item placed into her suitcase felt like an act of preservation rather than loss. She did not cry as she packed. Tears could come later, privately, when they would not be weaponized against her. When Colton walked in, surprised but not alarmed, Naomi met his gaze evenly. She didn't raise her voice or list grievances. She simply stated what she knew. The room felt suddenly smaller, as though truth had displaced all the air. Colton laughed, not nervously, not defensively, but confidently, as if this were a misunderstanding beneath his concern. He dismissed her pain with a smirk, the sound of his amusement cutting deeper than any denial. Then he said it, the words delivered casually, almost proudly, as though they were evidence of his superiority rather than his failure. "I'll replace you in 24 hours. The sentence hung between them, heavy and irrevocable. Naomi steadied him in that moment, seeing not the man she had loved, but the hunger that had always driven him. She closed her suitcase, lifted it with quiet strength, and moved toward the door. Colton watched, still smiling, certain he had won. Naomi paused only once, her hand resting briefly on the frame, and said calmly, "You already did." She didn't slam the door. She didn't look back. As she stepped into the night, the life she had built with him ended, not in chaos, but in clarity. Colton moved quickly, not because he was certain, but because speed made doubt irrelevant. By morning, Sienna Vale's presence in his life was no longer implied, it was displayed. She arrived with confidence sharpened by victory, carrying bags that suggested permanence rather than a visit. Colton framed the decision as inevitability, telling himself and anyone who would listen that he had simply aligned with someone who understood his world. Photos surfaced almost immediately, strategically casual, unmistakably intimate. The message was clear, replacement had occurred on schedule. Colton watched the reactions roll in, mistaking attention for validation. He didn't pause to consider how desperation hid beneath the spectacle, or how quickly he had transformed a private betrayal into a public declaration. In his mind, momentum equaled strength. He had replaced Naomi, and the world was watching. That, to him, felt like victory. Vera Reeve received the news with satisfaction thinly veiled as relief. She visited Colton that evening, surveying the apartment as if inspecting a corrected error. Sienna greeted her with charm calibrated to impress, offering deference without submission. Vera approved. She spoke openly, dismissively, calling Naomi temporary, a woman who had never truly belonged in their sphere. Colton absorbed his mother's words gratefully, allowing them to reinforce his narrative. Julian remained absent, his silence conspicuous and unsettling, but Colton dismissed it as disinterest. He had replaced one life with another, faster and louder, and believed that noise could drown consequence. Sienna, for her part, played her role flawlessly, attentive, flattering, present, while quietly assessing the leverage she now held. The replacement was complete, but its foundation was already unstable. Naomi experienced none of it in public. Owen Hartwell brought her home with quiet efficiency, saying little as she finally allowed herself to breathe. Inside the familiar walls of her childhood home, Naomi's composure cracked, not dramatically, but honestly. She cried without witnesses, grief arriving in waves she did not resist. Owen stayed nearby, offering presence rather than comfort he couldn't give. Naomi didn't speak of Colton's words, she didn't need to. What hurt most was not the replacement, but the certainty with which Colton had believed she was disposable. Yet even in that raw moment, something resolute took shape. Naomi understood that survival would require more than endurance, it would require reinvention. She didn't know how yet, or when. She only knew one thing with clarity sharper than pain: she would never again allow her worth to be measured by someone else's applause. Naomi refused to let her pain announce itself to the world. In the days that followed her return to her brother's home, she rejected sympathy that came wrapped in gossip and declined invitations that felt like distractions disguised as concern. She woke early, maintained routines, and began mapping her next steps with the same discipline her father had drilled into her years ago. There were moments, quiet, unguarded ones, when grief surged unexpectedly, but Naomi treated them as passing weather, not destinations. She updated her resume meticulously, reviewed her past work with fresh eyes, and confronted an uncomfortable truth: she had been competent, reliable, and invisible for too long. Reinvention, she realized, did not begin with grand declarations. It began with choosing not to collapse. Stability became her anchor, not because it was easy, but because it was hers to control. Miles Kidder entered her life again not as a rescuer, but as a gatekeeper. He had observed Naomi years earlier during a difficult hotel operation and remembered her calm under pressure. When Naomi approached him for work, he didn't offer encouragement or reassurance. Instead, he laid out the reality bluntly: long hours, high expectations, no room for mistakes, and no tolerance for emotional fragility. It was not a kindness, it was a challenge. Naomi accepted without negotiation. Her first weeks under Miles were relentless, filled with tasks designed to test endurance rather than talent. She managed logistics that others avoided, resolved conflicts without authority to lean on, and learned to anticipate failure before it arrived. Miles watched silently, measuring not speed but consistency. Naomi wasn't rebuilding her life with comfort, she was rebuilding it with competence, one exhausting day at a time. Respect came slowly, earned through repetition rather than brilliance. Colleagues began to rely on Naomi's judgment, not because she demanded trust, but because she delivered results without theatrics. She learned to assert boundaries without apology, to speak decisively without raising her voice, and to lead without seeking validation. In moments of quiet, Naomi reflected on how much of herself she had once compressed to fit into Colton's world. The realization was sobering, but it fueled her resolve. Reinvention, she discovered, was not about becoming someone new, it was about reclaiming the parts of herself she had abandoned for the sake of harmony. As Naomi stood on the threshold of a future she had not planned but was now actively shaping, she understood that silence could be powerful when it was chosen. And this silence was hers. Sienna Vale adjusted quickly to the privileges that came with proximity to Colton Reeve, but privilege, she learned, arrived with conditions. At first, everything felt intoxicating: access to rooms she had once circled from the outside, invitations that carried weight, introductions that opened doors without questions. Colton reveled in her admiration, mistaking her attentiveness for compatibility. Sienna, however, did not confuse affection with security. She began asserting influence subtly, questioning expenditures, suggesting which contacts were worth keeping, and reshaping Colton's schedule to center her presence. She framed control as support, intervention as concern. Colton noticed the shift only when decisions he once made freely began requiring negotiation. The replacement he had paraded so confidently now came with expectations that pressed against his autonomy. Sienna did not intend to be temporary, she intended to be indispensable. The strain surfaced in private moments first. Sienna criticized Colton's habits under the guise of refinement, questioned his alliances, and reminded him, frequently, of the image they needed to maintain. Colton resisted initially, bristling at what felt like constraint, but he also feared losing the admiration he had traded Naomi for. The dynamic inverted quietly, the man who needed applause now adjusted himself to keep it. Sienna watched carefully, testing boundaries, noting which objections faded when she withdrew warmth. She understood leverage instinctively. Yet beneath her calculated confidence was anxiety she could not fully suppress. Sienna knew how quickly favor could turn, how fragile position was when built on proximity rather than substance. Her crown, newly placed, shimmered, but its foundation was unstable, vulnerable to any truth that might surface. That truth came closer than Sienna expected, carried by Bianca Cross, her cousin and reluctant confidant. Bianca had watched Sienna reinvent herself too many times to be impressed by her latest ascent. Over coffee in a quiet corner far from Colton's orbit, Bianca spoke plainly, without accusation or envy. She reminded Sienna of the past she worked so hard to outrun, the choices, the alliances, the compromises that had never fully disappeared. "Your past is not buried," Bianca warned softly. "It's just quiet." Sienna dismissed the concern outwardly, but unease took root. She began glancing over her shoulder more often, guarding conversations, calculating exits. Control, she realized, required constant vigilance. And vigilance, sustained too long, revealed fear. As Colton sensed pressure mounting from all sides, Sienna understood that the crown she wore was made of sand, beautiful, temporary, and one strong wave away from collapse. Detective Mara Linwood's investigation narrowed with the patience of someone who understood that haste alerted predators. Patterns she had been tracking for months converged around a sequence of transactions that no longer looked coincidental. Shell agreements overlapped with rushed approvals, and timing anomalies suggested coordination rather than error. Harper Sloan's name appeared repeatedly, threaded through intermediaries who moved money just fast enough to evade routine audits. As Mara mapped the flows, she noticed a familiar tactic, complexity used as camouflage. The deeper she went, the clearer it became that this was not a single bad decision, but a system designed to absorb risk by spreading responsibility thin. Colton Reeve remained on the margins of her chart, present, influential, but not yet central. Mara marked him carefully. Ambition, she knew, often recruited accomplices before it revealed architects. The ledger was forming, and once complete, it would speak for itself. Naomi encountered the danger accidentally, through competence rather than curiosity. While overseeing a demanding operation under Miles Kidder's supervision, she was asked to reconcile an inherited contract, one she had once touched lightly years ago without consequence. This time, the numbers didn't align. Vendor terms conflicted with delivery timelines, and authorization signatures appeared duplicated across documents that should never have intersected. Naomi flagged the inconsistencies professionally, requesting clarification rather than raising alarms. The response she received was evasive, hurried, and instructive in its avoidance. Miles noticed her concern and advised caution without explanation, a warning in tone rather than words. Naomi sensed that her name, once invisible, had drifted into a conversation it didn't belong in. She didn't know who was watching, only that precision had placed her closer to risk than comfort. The file revealed itself late one evening, buried where no one expected it, within a routine archive labeled with disarming ordinariness. Naomi didn't set out to uncover it, she recognized it. A sequence of amendments, approvals, and temporary measures that, when read together, formed a quiet confession. The ledger suggested that Colton's recent success rested on accelerated decisions that bypassed safeguards, decisions Harper had championed and others had signed without scrutiny. Naomi felt a chill of recognition not as betrayal, but as inevitability. This wasn't about her marriage, it was about structure and consequence. She secured copies. carefully, documenting without dramatizing, understanding that truth required stewardship. As she closed the file, Naomi realized the reinvention she had begun in silence now demanded courage. The secret ledger existed, and once known, it could not be unknowingly ignored. The truth did not arrive with drama, it arrived with context, and context was more devastating than accusation. Naomi met Daphne Hartwell in a quiet place far from spectacle, a space chosen for discretion rather than comfort. Her mother looked older than Naomi remembered, not weakened, but sharpened by years of vigilance. Daphne spoke without sentimentality, explaining that her disappearance had not been abandonment but escape. Years earlier, Naomi's father had been pulled into a dangerous situation tied to powerful interests who preferred silence to accountability. Julian Reeve had intervened discreetly, not out of charity, but out of principle, creating a narrow corridor of safety that required Daphne to vanish to protect the family. The evidence Daphne carried had been preserved carefully, not as leverage, but as insurance. Naomi listened as the past rearranged itself, each piece locking into place. The absence that had shaped her life was not indifference, it was strategy born of necessity. The realization landed with crushing clarity. Colton had married into the one family that held the key to unraveling the very structure now elevating him. Naomi felt the weight of irony press against her ribs, heavy and precise. This was not revenge, it was convergence. The same discipline her father had taught her, the same restraint Daphne had lived by, had preserved truths powerful enough to shatter reputations if mishandled. Naomi understood the responsibility immediately. This was not a weapon to swing, it was a burden to carry correctly. The marriage, the betrayal, the replacement, none of it had created this power. It had always existed, dormant and patient, waiting for the moment when silence would do more harm than revelation. Naomi felt grief for the years lost to misunderstanding, but also a steadiness she hadn't known before. Her life had been shaped by choices made to protect her, now it was her turn to choose wisely. Julian Reeve sought Naomi out before she could seek him, requesting a meeting without intermediaries or pretense. He arrived alone, stripped of authority's armor, and spoke plainly. He told her what Colton didn't know, that Harper's shortcuts had metastasized into something uncontrollable, that Felix Rowe's containment had only delayed exposure, not prevented it. Julian asked nothing that resembled forgiveness, he asked for precision. Colton doesn't know what he's involved in, he said, voice steady but urgent. Naomi believed him, and that belief complicated everything. She saw clearly now, the truth could destroy, but it could also correct. As she left the meeting, Naomi understood that the next steps would define not only Colton's fate, but her own. The plot had shifted irrevocably, not toward vengeance, but toward consequence, and she was ready. Naomi chose deliberation over impulse, strategy over spectacle. She met Detective Mara Linwood not as a scorned ex-wife seeking revenge, but as a professional steward of information who understood the gravity of timing. Naomi brought documentation carefully curated, copies, timelines, contextual notes, presented without commentary or dramatization. Mara listened, asked precise questions, and recognized the difference between rumor and record. Naomi made one thing clear, she would cooperate fully and legally, without leaks or leverage plays. This was not about humiliating Colton or claiming moral victory, it was about stopping a structure that rewarded speed over truth. The decision cost Naomi sleep and certainty, but it anchored her in purpose. For the first time since the night she packed her bags, she felt aligned, calm not as avoidance, but as resolve. Truth, she learned, didn't need noise. It needed accuracy. Harper Sloan sensed the shift before evidence moved. He noticed delayed responses, guarded language, and the sudden tightening of channels he once controlled. Panic sharpened his instincts. To survive, he needed a scapegoat, someone close enough to be plausible and distant enough to discard. Naomi's name surfaced quickly, framed as a coordinator with access, a convenient intermediary. Harper fed fragments to Felix Rowe, urging him to seed doubt before certainty arrived. Felix attempted containment, floating narratives designed to muddy sequence and motive. But the strategy faltered under scrutiny, contradictions multiplied. Harper pressed harder, growing reckless, and in doing so exposed the very urgency he sought to hide. The more he maneuvered, the clearer it became who feared daylight. Harper's mask, charming, decisive, cracked under pressure, revealing desperation beneath polish. Sienna Vale discovered her role that same night, not through confession but through omission. Conversations stopped including her. Decisions happened without her input. When she pressed Colton, he deflected, distracted by crises he couldn't explain. Sienna recognized the pattern immediately. She had been positioned as atmosphere, not partner. Distraction, not shield. Her value had been proximity, and proximity was now dangerous. She attempted to exit gracefully, packing essentials, calling Bianca for help, calculating which doors might still open. But momentum had turned. The rooms she once commanded now felt hostile, ice colder, smiles thinner. Sienna understood then that alignment built on secrecy collapses without warning. As Naomi moved with intention, Harper unraveled, and Sienna fled the margins of a storm she could no longer control. The night stripped illusions from every face involved. The collapse did not arrive with a single explosion. It came as a series of locks clicking shut all at once. Contracts stalled, then froze, as partners invoked review clauses and legal teams requested clarifications that could no longer be deferred. Meetings were canceled without rescheduling. Calls went unanswered. The momentum Colton had relied on evaporated, leaving behind a silence that felt accusatory. Headlines avoided names at first, speaking in cautious language about irregularities and pending inquiries, but the market read between the lines. Confidence, once Colton's most dependable currency, lost value overnight. Harper Sloan vanished from visibility, his absence louder than any denial. Felix Rowe's reassurances thinned into careful distance. What Colton had built on speed and admiration now faced scrutiny that moved slower, heavier, and with memory. He paced rooms that once felt triumphant, realizing that applause had never been a foundation, only an echo. Vera Reeve felt the humiliation viscerally. Invitations dried up. Conversations shifted. The same circles that once deferred now observed her with polite distance, curiosity replacing reverence. She attempted control, calls, reminders of legacy, veiled threats, but influence requires belief, and belief had fractured. In a public setting she could not avoid, Vera was forced to listen as whispers traveled faster than her authority. Julian Reeve, long silent, finally stepped forward, not to defend the indefensible, but to refuse further complicity. He corrected narratives where he could, declined favors where they were expected, and drew a line that isolated him from his wife's tactics. The fracture within the family became visible, undeniable. Julian's choice did not absolve the past, but it ended its expansion. For the first time, consequence took precedence over appearance, and the Reeve name felt the weight of its own reflection. Colton went looking for Naomi when denial exhausted itself. He arrived without strategy, without polish, carrying the raw unraveling he had avoided for years. He found her steadier than he remembered, focused, composed, unyielding in a way that wasn't cruel. She listened without interruption as he spoke of confusion, of betrayal by allies, of not understanding how everything had turned so quickly. Naomi did not argue or correct him. She did not reveal what she knew or claim credit for what had happened. She told him only this: survival built on shortcuts eventually collapses, and clarity arrives whether one invites it or not. As Colton left, smaller and quieter than he had entered, Naomi felt no triumph, only closure. The fire had burned away illusion. What remained was truth, and it was enough. Naomi Hartwell launched her company without spectacle, choosing substance over noise. With Miles Ketter's backing and her own carefully earned credibility, she built an event and hospitality management firm grounded in reliability, ethics, and calm execution. She refused shortcuts, documented everything, and hired people who valued preparation over performance. Early contracts were modest but demanding, and Naomi welcomed that. Pressure had taught her precision. She worked long hours not to prove worth, but to protect standards. Clients noticed. Word spread quietly that Naomi delivered stability when stakes were high. The business grew not through publicity, but through trust. Naomi no longer introduced herself through association. Her name stood alone, sufficient. In private moments, she felt the weight of what she had survived, not as a wound, but as context. She understood now that reinvention was not erasure, it was alignment. Her life had become intentional again, ordered not by fear, but by choice. Healing arrived unevenly, stitched together through ordinary days and honest conversations. Naomi rebuilt family ties with patience, allowing closeness without rushing forgiveness. Her father's steady presence remained her anchor, and with Daphne, truth replaced absence, painful, necessary, and ultimately clarifying. They did not rewrite the past, they understood it. Owen remained watchful but proud, offering support without intrusion, while Raina celebrated Naomi's milestones with unfiltered joy. These relationships did not demand performance. They required presence. Naomi learned to rest without guilt, to experience happiness without bracing for loss. The calm she had sought since childhood no longer felt fragile. It was resilient, earned through clarity and maintained through boundaries. In choosing herself repeatedly, Naomi found that peace did not shrink her world, it expanded it. Colton faced consequences that could not be negotiated away. Without applause to shield him, he confronted the limits of charisma and the cost of deflection. Sienna disappeared from the spotlight, her ambition dissolving into anonymity as quickly as it had risen. The structures that once rewarded speed corrected themselves slowly, methodically. Naomi did not watch their outcomes closely, she no longer needed distance to define her worth. One evening, after closing a successful contract, she stood alone in her office, lights low, city steady beyond the windows. She felt gratitude, not for the pain, but for the clarity it forced. Her final victory was not dominance or recognition. It was peace that required no permission. Naomi closed the door behind her, stepped forward into the life she had built, and understood this was her beginning, and it was enough. Thank you for listening to Luxurious Tales. If this tale moved you, share it with someone, leave a comment, and let us know what you felt. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Until next time.